Wonderful, thank you. All right, well, greetings, everybody. I'm sure some of you recognize me from last winter. I'm Zoanne. I'm the reference historian for the Montana Historical Society. And for those of you who have not visited us, the last 6 months or so, you know that it's chaos around here. We've got construction going, and it's unbelievable what they're doing outside. So if you have nothing better to do, come on by and just drive by the Historical Society to see how they are expanding the museum space. It's pretty exciting, if not noisy. All right. I've been working here as a reference historian for 16 years, and as an inevitable process of that, I have found some great stories or personalities that I think of when people ask me what's my favorite part? I don't have a favorite part. I have hundreds of favorite parts. But I hope that you will enjoy these stories and at the same time start coming up with your own stories. And before we sign off, Dave, I want to know what mountain range that is. Okay.
It's the mission range out of Ronan, looking from Ronan to the east.
They're beautiful, thank you. Cold. Okay. There's no way that, in my mind, I could start storytelling about Montana without first mentioning, and I will end with Charlie Russell as well. This is one of the paintings that's considered one of his masterpieces, although he has many. And this is called When the Land Belonged to God. And he hit here after there were hundreds of thousands of buffalo in Montana, but he certainly was able to see buffalo and to hear the stories of how dense the buffalo population was at one time. And so here we are, we've got thousands of buffalo coming across the Missouri River up to a bluff. And it's gorgeous with sky colors that only Charlie Russell can do. But another interesting thing about this painting is we had a conservator, the Historical Society had a conservator several years ago come and clean it. It had been hanging in the Montana Club for decades before the Montana Historical Society was able to purchase it. And it was fascinating to visit her, and she did. She had a Q-tip, and she cleaned this massive painting with a Q-tip and special fluids. But as she worked on this, she discovered where Charlie Russell changed his mind in the painting. And the first and the most obvious place is the wolf here. And you see this profile, it just looks like some sticks or grass. And actually that was the wolf's profile before Charlie Russell focused in on having the face here. And then I believe it's this calf. There's evidence right around here that the calf was looking over to the calf's left. But for whatever reason, Charlie Russell essentially erased those and put them where we see them now. But amazing little insights into Charlie Russell's process and his amazing storytelling. All right. One of my many favorite stories is about the Kootenai and their search for a black robe or a Jesuit priest. And early on, as Lewis and Clark and Hudson Bay Company goes through the Flathead and the Bitterroot, there are prophecies coming from the Salish that they need to get the power of the black robes, which are the Jesuit priests. And then this is confirmed with Iroquois who were working for, Hudson Bay in the East. And of course, there in the East, they were familiar with the Jesuit priests. Now, between 1831 and 1840, the Salish sent out 4 expeditions of men to try to talk a Black Robe into coming to the Bitterroot. The first expedition was in 1831, and all but one delegate died. And as you can imagine, as soon as these men would hit what we consider civilization, the germs, the sicknesses would just lay them low. But by the 4th delegation, that's in 1839, they ran into Father de Smet, who was at Council Bluffs on the Missouri. They did some talking, and the next year, de Smet shows up with Iroquois guides, and he visits the Salish, then heads back to St. Louis to get funding to start a mission there. The summer of 41, we see Father de Smet, 2 other priests, and several brothers, who are all craftsmen, setting up shop, shall we say, in the Bitterroot Valley. And they create what we know as St. Mary's Mission. Initially, the church, the Roman church, and the Salish got along beautifully because there were some really interesting parallels between their religions. The rituals, for one thing, the spirituality was similar, and I would venture a guess, it sounds as though, from what de Smet describes, the Salish were reveling in this introduction of this new language. In fact, he writes that the Flatheads appear to be the chosen people, the elect of God. Sadly, the mission only lasts about 10 years because there were some conflicts. And of course, the Salish had trouble with the European concept of sin. They had trouble with the idea that they were supposed to make peace with their Blackfeet enemies. And then as the mission system grew, the Jesuits created places for the Blackfeet, or missions for the Blackfeet. And quite honestly, the Salish saw this as betrayal. And even though then the native religion did have to go underground, I believe there are some very strong traditions and beliefs left from both the native tradition and how they incorporated the Catholic religion. So it's, again, talk about perseverance. 4 expeditions to find a priest. That's pretty serious. Then my next one is a personality. And before I get into this, I'm going to remind you that we are the Montana State Archives. And initially that means we collect the legislative record, but it means so much more than that. We have journals, we have business records, we have diaries down in the archives, and they are waiting for people to come look at them. And there's nothing that we will not bring upstairs for you, including the journals and the diaries of Lieutenant James Bradley. We have every spring, we have a fellowship, and it's coming up to closing time. As I look at it, it will close March 1st, called the Bradley Fellowship, because on many levels, he is what I would consider the father of written Montana history. He was in the Civil War as a very, very young man, and he re-enlisted afterwards and was quickly promoted to lieutenant. From 1866, for the next 11 years, he was stationed primarily in Wyoming, Utah, and Montana territories, although in 1871, he was sent to Alabama to suppress the Ku Klux Klan. I can't say it. Oh, the KKK, who were trying to undermine the freedom of the African Americans down there. So while he was down there, he met an Isabella Beach. He married her, and in 1872, he brought her to Montana, and they lived between Fort Benton and Fort Shaw, depending on where he was stationed. Now, the amazing thing about Bradley, one of the many amazing things, is that he sought out, so we're talking the 1870s, but he sought out the old timers of that time. And one of the folks that he interviewed is Alexander Culbertson, who was one of the founders of Fort Benton. He does studies of the Salish, of the Blackfeet, the Crow Vaughn, and writes essays about them. So we get those first impressions. And he is probably most known in Western history for the journal he kept. The summer of 1876, he was on the same expedition as the 7th Cavalry and Custer. Fortunately for Bradley, he was in charge of a couple dozen Crow Scouts and a couple other infantrymen, and they managed to not be at the wrong spot at the wrong time. However, the Crow Scouts knew exactly what was going on with Custer and reported the debacle to Bradley, and he had the unenviable obligation of reporting to his superiors that Custer and his men had been wiped out. That night, so it would have been the Sunday night that Custer, and after the battle, and Bradley reports it, and his commanding officers refuse to believe it. And he writes about his Crow Scouts wailing in grief outside of the tent. And he just paints this amazing picture of disaster and camaraderie, and how different people were handling the news of Custer dying along with his men. So James Bradley, and I have to tell you, there's something exciting about getting into the same journals that he wrote in. And I hope that you will find an interest in this and come visit us and do that. And it's hard. I just realized that I might be a little Western centric here, Western Montana, but we'll just keep on going. And by the way, this is the missions in the background too. This is my favorite, one of my favorite stories, because not just the story itself and the legacy that Michel Pablo and his partner Allard left to Montana, but the fact that this process was documented. And I will point you to the stereograph up on top, where a bull buffalo has broken through the sides of a railroad car. And this won't come as a surprise to those of us who were raised in Montana, but buffalo don't want to be in a railroad car. And when you have 2,000 pounds of force, it's really hard, it's almost impossible to control them. So the story behind this is that, and there are several different stories, but suffice to say that Pablo and Allard bought about a dozen or so young buffalo from a man who had acquired them as calves outside of St. Ignatius. And then the partners moved their newly acquired herd to open range, and the herd thrived. Michel Pablo was the rancher and the nurturer, I would say, whereas Allard was more outgoing, and he served as their promotional person. Sadly, Allard passes away in the 1896. And so the herd is divided in half. There are 300 head. So Allard's, that's his inheritance. And his widow and children get 150 buffalo. And they sell the buffalo, those 150, and you're not gonna believe this, but it's amazing. So those 150 that they sold around the country were the descendants of many who are still on the National Buffalo Range, the South Dakota State Park herd, and the Yellowstone National Park herd. And they also are part of many private breeding stocks, including ranches in Texas, as well as ranches in Canada. And that's just the beginning of the Pablo Ellard legacy. So Pablo takes care of his buffalo. There are stories of him just riding and enjoying the buffalo. He didn't call them cowboys, he called them buffalo herders. And after looking at this big guy going through the railroad car, I can imagine that, yeah, you probably want to have a special title if you're trying to round up buffalo. But Pablo's herd flourished, and they were at 700 head by 1906. And by 1906, the Flathead Valley and the Bitterroot had been opened for homesteading, and Pablo was wise enough to know that homesteading was not going to mix with his buffalo. He attempted to sell the herd to the US government, and the US government couldn't make up their mind, but the Canadian government said, we want them. And Pablo in 1906 said, well, give us a year and we'll get them shipped to you. It took 6 years to get the buffalo collected, those who could be collected, and then shipped to Canada. And as an example, just this bull breaking through the side of a stock car. Again, the buffalo were not created to be put in stock cars or stockades. At one point, the cowboys, the Buffalo Boys, created a pen with up against a clay bank, and they left a couple hundred buffalo there overnight. Well, the buffalo just went over the clay bank, and then according to the account, there was just one old cow left when they got there that morning, and so they started again. But so Pablo sold the bulk of his herd. There were about 100 that the cowboys just could not collect. And so 600 wound up in Canada. And ironically, it's not long before then the federal government, the US federal government, does acknowledge then the National Buffalo Range there above St. Ignatius. And the buffalo there are direct descendants of those stubborn animals who refused to go to Canada. Those men have left us an amazing legacy and a great story. Now, those of you who have heard me talk before, you may have seen this, but I've got to mention this story. So one of my favorite cookbooks, and we've got 1,000 Montana cookbooks here in the library, is the Ladies Society Cookbook from Red Lodge, and it's the Ladies Society of the Congregational Church. And yes, I'm proud to say I am a reader of cookbooks, especially old cookbooks. And I started in on this because Butte has a reputation for having multi-ethnic diets and recipes. And I found the same in Red Lodge with a few differences. So there were several recipes that came from either a Mr. Ling, a Mr. Lee, or a gentleman called Jim Chinaman. And they read like the recipe up here: wash him well, much wash in cold water the rice, flour make him stick, water boil already very fast, throw him in. And another one is 2 eggs, is for custard, 2 eggs, 1 cup milk, 3 spoons sugar, have slow fire, not cook long, spoil it. And at first I was struck by the language, of course, and thinking that these were pejorative and some sort of a satire of these men. And then I started doing research, and the Mr. Lee, who narrated some of these, had Chinese restaurants in the Carbon County area. And he advertises one here. I'm not sure if you can see it behind you, but it's the most modern restaurant in Carbon County. He's very, very proud of it, as he should be. And I was able to find other hints that there were more Chinese restaurants. I just could not find Mr. Ling or the gentleman who called himself Jim Chinaman. So it's my belief, and I'm going to stick to this until someone can make a good argument against it, that the women were not making fun of the gentleman's lack of English, but they were serious about getting those recipes and followed them verbatim and copied them in the cookbook, just the way Mr. Lee, Mr. Ling, and Mr. Chinaman narrated them. Great stuff. And don't forget those 999 other cookbooks we have downstairs. This is just a rather, it goes from I'm going to say disaster to humor. And in 1908, Montana, May and June was struck with rain and snowmelt. It created one of the worst floods in Montana history. May 31st, track near Columbus washed out. There was too much snow in Butte for outdoor Memorial Day activities. June 9th, almost an inch of rain fell in Butte. The storm system hit most of western Montana. It tracks were washed out of eastern Missoula, and that resulted in a train plunging off the tracks and one fatality. Trains were halted in Billings and Livingston, stranding thousands of passengers. By June 4th, Butte's white ice pond failed, starting a domino effect as the water followed the course of the Silver Bow Creek. So 4 feet of water deep in places was going down the Silver Bow Creek. It took out power and it went through Milltown Dam eventually. And I just shudder to think of the mine tailings and whatnot that were pushed down the mountainside from that, all the pollution from Butte to Milltown. So right before this time, there was a conference in Washington, D.C., attended by Governor Norris and some of his compatriots. They wound up being stranded in Livingston for 2 nights, a Sunday and Monday. And the governor decided he had waited long enough, so he and about 19 other frustrated travelers took the train that took them about 10 miles outside of Livingston, so about 10 miles up the pass, and they were left to their own devices. They walked 15 miles, including a trek through the mile-long train tunnel near the pass. And then they were treated to dinner at a small coal camp outside of Bozeman. And I can only imagine the surprise as they walked into the coal miners' camp, because they were probably dressed a lot different than the coal miners. There was word sent to Helena that these gentlemen were arriving, and there was a special train sent from Helena to pick them up within a day or two. It's fun to read the newspaper reports because it's it kind of just takes for granted that the governor, of course, the governor is going to take a walk. It's kind of cool, but what did you expect him to do? And I just get a chuckle out of that. But lots of humor can be found in Montana stories as well as the newspapers. So the next stories are not that humorous, but fascinating. And again, fascinating not only because of their existence, but how they were collected. When survivors of the Titanic, and there were several survivors, several people headed to Montana. On the Titanic, there were small town newspaper reporters waiting at the train to take their statements. And news just doesn't get any better than that. History and stories don't get any better than that. So the gentleman on the left is William, and he was known as Gilliam, the mesa maker. And he and his brothers had homesteaded outside of Saco. And of course, we all know where Saco is, right? Maybe outside of Glasgow, west of Glasgow. But they homesteaded during a time that they would have made pretty good profit. So he would have been a prosperous man. And he went home to Belgium to find a bride. And he married an Anna. And darn if they didn't decide to have their honeymoon on the Titanic. He talks about, and there are other testimonies about this, but he insists that Anna get on a lifeboat. She fights him tooth and nail, but someone lifts her up and puts her in a lifeboat. And they lower the lifeboat. And he believes that he's seen the last of her. But whether it's because he knew what he was doing, he spoke the language, I don't know how he was dressed, but the officer for the next lifeboat told him to get in the boat and help out, and he did. So he and Anna were reunited when everything settled down. The lady in the middle is Ludi Parrish. She and her daughter, Imanita, were seasoned travelers, and they were second class. And her daughter not only left an account, she wrote an account for Congress. And the Deer Lodge newspaper reported that verbatim. And again, stories just don't get much better than that. But she does start by complaining about the second class accommodations. She wasn't happy with them. But again, they were seasoned travelers. Perhaps she was spoiled. And then the last of the folks that I want to mention are two very young people. We've got an Edward Larson Ronberg, who had worked at the Atlantic Hotel and Restaurant on North Higgins in Missoula, and he had saved enough money to go home to Sweden. He was bringing a friend back. Her name was Berta Nilsson. Now, the early reports say that they are engaged, but Berta makes it absolutely, she wants people to know, no, they were not engaged. It's one of the first things she says when she gets off the train. And it's interesting to get into the history of this, and not just the stories, but what was happening behind the scenes. So Berta could not speak English. She just spoke Swedish. But the Swedish community in New York City rallied around the Swedish survivors of the Titanic and made certain that they each had a little money in their pocket and got to their final destinations. And the same can be said for other ethnic groups and civil groups in New York. The survivors survived, thankfully, and were treated well. So the next story is about Tommy Haw. And he was a cowboy and a miner. And in 1886, Johnny Grant, I'm sure you've all been to the Grant Ranch in Deer Lodge, had been traveling, and he listed the names in his journal of the people he spent nights with who put him up overnight. And he talks about a Chinaman who is partnering with two white men as a cattleman. And historians are pretty sure that this is Tommy Haw, because there were not a whole lot of Chinamen allowed to own anything in Montana at that time. And this is what he wrote. When Grant asked him how much he owed him, the Chinaman replied, "Nothing, nothing. When you see a Chinaman in need, give him a meal." And that's the best of the story. But the story does go on. So Tommy Haw, and again, we've got legend and myth, don't know which is which from reality, but we do know that he was socially associated with the Orr family. We don't know if Mr. Orr found him as an orphan in San Francisco. There's stories of Indian massacres and Tommy Haw surviving as a young child. We don't know for sure. What we do know is that Mr. Haw was educated with the Orr kids and was a successful businessman. He started out by ranching, and as you can see, as early as 1873, he had the brand OC, which ironically stands for Orr's Chinaman. When he passed away, and he was just in his 50s when he passed away, all the elite from Beaverhead County were at his graveside. One of the gentlemen who just beat the odds and was hardworking and kind from the sounds of it. Now, the next two stories are about bank robberies. And shockingly, Montana's had a lot of bank robberies, but two grab my interest. The first takes place in February in Medicine Lake. And that is close to, I'm going to say, the eastern border of Montana. Two young men break into the bank. Well, they don't break in, they walk in. They tie up everybody who's at the bank. And interestingly enough, as if this is hard to read, but the people who were tied up knew who one of the boys was. One of the robbers is said to be young John Johnson, a son of Cow Johnson, who lives over near the Dakota line and who is not more than 17 years of age. The other man is a little bit older. Well, the other man we see a picture of here, his name was Magnor Hansen, and he's been easy to trace because there are not a whole lot of gentlemen called Magnor. But they left, those young men left with almost $3,000, and they were homesteaded children. So imagine how much money that must have seemed. And Magnor took off for the west, where Johnny Johnson took off for the east. Johnny was able to make it into the Dakotas and get rid of his posse. Magnor, on the other hand, was not able to throw the posse. And again, I say this every time, whether the posse was faster than Johnny Johnson's or Magnor's horse was slower, either way, it ended the same way. He was shot off his horse and they brought him in, and he's shot in the right shoulder. Interestingly enough, he later tells his family that that's a wound he sustained in the war. So I know that most of his family did not know about Magnor's time in the state penitentiary. But he is released on a release program going in as the United States is going into Europe in World War I. And I like to think that maybe he was shot in the same spot, so he wasn't actually lying to his family. He comes home, he marries a school teacher in North Dakota, is a farmer, and they have a big family. And as far as I can tell, he never told his family about his time at the Montana State Penitentiary. Johnny Johnson, little Johnny Johnson, by the way, takes another track he is extradited from Wyoming to Montana. By 1920, where Magnor is settled with a school teacher, Johnny Johnson is in a federal facility in California, and he goes on to lead a horrific life of crime. And I'm not sure how there is rumor that, shall I say, a very rough character who was killed in Alaska was Johnny Johnson, but I don't have proof of that. I just know that he probably ended up badly. So we have one boy who going to the state penitentiary was enough, and he changed his ways, and another young man who just couldn't change his ways. Now, I sent the story of the Harrison Bank robbery to Michelle. And Michelle, if you need me to drop off hard copies, I can do that too. Because I cannot tell you without just reading verbatim how convoluted this bank robbery was. 1930, October 27th. We've got three guys, Harrington, Varnes, and Jackson, who are plotting to rob the Harrison State Bank. And we all know where Harrison is, right? Right below Pony, right before Norris Hot Springs. Nobody knows where Harrison is? You guys.
Yeah, they got a restaurant down there. It's pretty good.
There you go. There you go. And if you go to Pony, there are hot springs up above Pony that are well worth visiting. But the three bad guys get together and start talking about robbing the bank. Well, as it turns out, Ralph Harrington is actually a nephew for the bank of the bank directors. So Harrington's planning on having his cake and to eat it too. He reports to his uncle what's going on. And of course, his uncle then calls law enforcement. He calls Sheriff Mitzel out of Madison County, who is up for election in just 10 days. He takes special care of Mr. Krieg, who's the cashier, because part of the plan was to kidnap Krieg and his wife. And so they get Krieg out of the bank. And then the sheriff goes and deputizes a lot of interesting gentlemen to help apprehend everybody. So we've got Young, Fitzhugh, Fred Brownback, Jim Nicholson as only part of the deputized posse. And then we have Clarence Bell, who was providing sanctuary for the Kriegs, and their place was on the way to Pony. Let's see, their place was west of Pony. And get a map to find out where Pony and Harrison are. Anyway, so Kriegs are sent to Clarence Bell's house. And then, just to make things a little more complicated, Sam Young's son, his surname is Young, Buddy Young, overhears his dad and these guys making plans for stopping the bank robbery. And so Buddy Young and his buddy, Harold Marshall, do what teenage boys do. They took the father's car and parked on the edge of town to watch it, what came down. Well, because of the lack of experience with the posse, things go amok. There's a shot is fired. It warns Varnes and Jackson. They get away initially with a lot of money. Harrington sticks around because he thinks he's entitled to some money for turning them in. And things go even worse because when the teenage boys get on the road to Pony and to the Bell place, Sheriff Metzel and another man think that they're the bad guys trying to get away. And so they chase these young boys down. But the boys are able to get to the Bell place and find sanctuary. They believe they've been chased by the bad guys. And sadly, Sheriff Metzel gets shot and killed by another good guy because they think he's coming up to the porch of the Bell place and they think he's a bad guy. From bad to worse, from bad to worse. And please let me know or let Michelle know if you want a written account of this by Dave Walter. You've got to read it to believe it. Then my last personality is someone we don't hear about very often, but Montana needs to be so proud of this woman. This is Jeanette Kelly. She was born and raised amongst family in Deer Lodge, Montana. In 1915, right around there, she graduated from Deer Lodge's community, I'm going to call it the normal school. And then she went for 2 or 3 years to the Montana State University and graduated with what would have been a very sophisticated degree at that time in home economics. I mean, home economics is a hard degree, but at that time it was new and adventurous, and cooking was just becoming science. It just goes on and on and on. Right away, she goes to work for the Montana Extension Office. She makes a name for herself working with children's groups, baking, raising chickens, you name it, they do it. And she attracts the attention of a group that is called, it's escaped my memory. Just a minute, I gotta look here. A group called Washburn Crosby, and they are destined to become gold medal flour. She goes around the East Coast and she establishes sophisticated labs, cooking labs. And she is one of the first women to do this. And because there are a couple of her contemporaries doing the same thing. But during her time is when Betty Crocker, who is fictitious, became popular. And so she is often referred to as Montana's Betty Crocker. Betty Crocker was fictitious, but I'm going to say that Jeanette Kelly was one of the powerhouses behind her. And for those of us who were raised in the 50s and 60s, this cookbook is familiar because everybody had it. And this was groundbreaking publication from Betty Crocker, or from General Mills, in 1950. And it was new and unusual because it went step by step. It did not assume a lot of earlier cookbooks assumed that the cook knew what they were doing and just gave ingredients, but not Betty Crocker. She assumed that none of us knew what we were doing, and gives pictures and just specific detail. But of course, all of that was created in the kitchen, created by Jeanette Kelly. She died way too young. She was in her 50s. And I would like to think that she would have been even more of a pioneer had she been able to live longer. So Jeanette Kelly, straight out of Montana, educated in Montana, a powerhouse at General Mills and behind Betty Crocker. And then I'm going to wrap up, begin and end with Charlie Russell. I don't know if you're familiar with this. This is, again, I guess I have a lot of I have a lot of favorite Charlie Russells. This one is Laugh Cures Lonesome. And to me, this tells us so much. For one thing, just the title tells us a lot about Charlie Russell. He liked to laugh. And here we've got Charlie Russell. That's a self-portrait there on the right. Let's see if I can get my lid right here. This is Charlie Russell. But we've got the end of the day. We've got a cook there in the back of the chuck wagon cleaning skillets from the looks of it. And we have cowboys around the fire, probably drinking coffee. It looks like they're smoking and they're laughing. And isn't that one of the reasons that we share our stories, is so that we can laugh? There are lots of serious stories. We have to take them seriously, but also there are a lot of wonderful stories. And I hope you as a family collect your stories and get them written down, or tell them to your grandkids before they're lost, because your stories are just as important as any as I've portrayed here. Thank you for putting up with me.
Oh, Zoanne, it's always our pleasure. We love having you.
Good.
Does anybody have any questions for Zoanne?
I'll tell you that the Medicine Lake bank robbery there that you talked about on there, that you could darn near, at least today anyway, well, a few years back anyway, that you could darn near spit from one end of the town to the other and stuff on there, to let alone have $3 grand at that.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, time of the year and stuff. And mostly I think it's growing wheat around there is what it would have come from on it. But man, that was kind of amazing on there. They have one of the national wildlife places there for the ducks and stuff, just real short. And I can't remember the name. It's the Medicine Lake something or other on it.
That's wonderful, Dave. I didn't realize it was that small. I knew it was a small community, and the idea of these two young people walking in to rob a bank and the chances of people knowing them. What can I say? They were teenagers.
Yeah. Well, that whole area there, the northeast part of Montana there, that everybody knows everybody.
Yeah.
100-mile circle around there, up into Canada and down below and stuff. Over, you still do quite a little bit of shopping over in the northwestern part of North Dakota.
Oh.
On it, and some of the doctors, you got to go get doctored over there on it. That even Glasgow didn't just a few years ago even have that much medical part on it.
That's interesting. That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Anything else?
Thank you for the stories also on there. Brought lots of memories of running around the country and stuff on it for me on it. But you do a real good job all the time on it. Thank you.
I do like to BS. What can I say? I do like it. And with a history degree, I can say that I'm a professional BSer. So
I'll tell you,
you.
De Schmidt stuff on there. He was the first one that brought irrigation into Montana. And that was 1843, I think, just a couple of years after he got here and stuff on it. And I'm not exactly sure if it was on up on where the reservation that we think of now, the Salish Kootenai up there, or if it was down in the Bitterroot. And I didn't realize for a long time there's a small segment that is still part of the reservation down there, and that had great symbolism, religious symbolism for him down there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a testament to the Salish and just maybe their stubbornness, but I just love that story. And I think I didn't know about the irrigation, Dave, but I think it's down there around St. Mary's that Montana got her first fruit trees that were brought in by the Jesuits.
That could very well be.
Makes sense.
They tried to, I thought he was there a lot longer than 10 years and stuff on it. My impression from the stories, talking with people from up there on it. But the one thing, where does the Kootenai come into this, the Kootenai tribe? Or, that the Salish there was quite a little bit over into Washington on there that they got over the hills there and back and forth on it. And they were one of the first tribes to sign treaties. And over the years, they lost a lot of their land, but they're trying to buy it all back on there. And that to me, that I'm pleased to see that on it. But anytime anything comes on up for sale, they buy it.
That's what I've heard. Yeah. Well, I will try to find some reading. Boy, you're getting into what I consider Montana prehistory, and I am all about the written word, I'm afraid, and BS. So I do know that for several years they were studying, ethnologists were studying the Kootenai tribe's language because they were having trouble figuring out where it originated from. The Kootenai had been isolated up there in the Kootenai Valley for so long that their language had become really unusual and unique. And I do know that they did eventually trace it to, I think it was other plateau languages, but I know that there was lots of trading between the tribes, but as far as when we start talking about the creation of the Kootenai Salish reservation, I'm sure that had everything to do with how the white man wanted the reservation to be, but I don't know how that, I don't know the specifics. I see someone shaking their head. No.
Yeah, I was just shaking my head because it was how the white man wanted the reservation to be instead of people that lived on the reservation wanted the reservation to be.
That's exactly right on there. And we had a way of screwing things up, that's for sure.
They did. Well, from what little current reading I've been able to do, it sounds as though that the Salish native religion is as strong and alive, but they've managed to incorporate it with Catholicism. And that just makes me smile and happy. I was raised Catholic, and that the symbolism, once you're raised with it, it's hard to get rid of it. It's hard not to be comfortable around it. So the fact that they sent out so many emissaries before they got a Jesuit priest is mind-boggling to me. Mind-boggling. There are amazing people here in Montana. We just need to look around. They're everywhere.
Well, Zoanne, thank you so much for joining us again. We're so excited to have you back, and you'll be with us in 2 weeks again, right?
I will.
And what are we
but
going to talk about then?
I can't remember.
Something about toys, favorite toys? Was that right?
Oh, yes. I
Okay.
haven't done that in a long time. That will be fun.
Good, right
That
on.
will be fun.
Okay.
What our toys say about us. Yep. I have a fight between Ken and G.I. Joe.
Nice. That's awesome. All right, well, we look forward to that.
Thank you,
Thank you
everybody.
again so much for being with us today, and we'll have the recording of this presentation out on the Rocky website probably sometime next week. So if you know of anybody that might be interested in it, you can let them know where to find it.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye, everybody.